So this is the first time I'm sharing this story with you. Yeah? Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Once upon a time, in a little village, there lived a blind man with his sister. Now this blind man was very wise, and often he would sit in the village square and people would ask him questions and he would give them answers. And every time they asked him, how is it that someone who's so young is so wise? He would smile and say, it's because I see with my years. Now the blind man had a brother-in-law, the hunter, and every day when the hunter would set out in the morning, the blind man would ask him, please, can I come with you? I really want to go hunting. But the hunter would just look at him and laugh and say, what's the use of taking a blind man with me? You live in a world of darkness. You're just going to slow me down. But every day the blind man would ask him, please, brother, take me hunting with you. And the days went by. The days became weeks and the weeks became months. One day, you see, the hunter came back. He'd had a good day and he was in a very good mood. So he announced to the blind man that the next day they would go hunting. Oh, the blind man was ecstatic. This was the moment that he'd been waiting for. He was up early in the morning, ready to go out on the hunt. And the hunter and the blind man went into the forest. The hunter took the blind man by his hand, leading him through into the forest. And as they walked and talked, the blind man stopped in his tracks. Shh, he said. There's a lion. But don't worry, because he's just had a feed and he's not going to, there's nothing to worry about. The hunter looked around and he couldn't see the lion. And he continued walking. And lo and behold, there in the clearing was a lion, stretched out by a freshly eaten carcass with his belly full. How did you know that there was a lion? He asked the blind man. And the blind man smiled and replied, it's because I see with my ears. And they continued walking deeper and deeper into the forest. And again, the blind man stopped in his tracks and said, shh, there's an elephant. But that's fine, because he's just by a watering hole having a drink of water. And the hunter once again looked around. There was no elephant in sight. And he carried on walking. And lo and behold, there was an elephant having a drink of water. How did you know? He said. How did you know that there was an elephant? And the blind man replied, it's because I see with my ears. They walked on a little further into the forest, and the hunter laid 2 traps to return the next day. The next day in the morning, the blind man was up again, ready to go on the hunt. And as they set off, he led the way this time. He didn't need the hunter's guidance. He knew exactly where to go. And just as they got to the traps, he slowed down. And the hunter immediately noticed that there was a little grey bird in his trap. But in the blind man's trap, there was a beautiful bird, a bird with feathers of blue and green and crimson. He wanted the bird for himself. So as he walked towards the traps, he thought to himself, what is the point of this beautiful bird to the blind man? How will he know if I switch the birds? And he took the grey bird from the trap and he gave it to the blind man. And he took this beautiful bird for himself. And as they walked back, the hunter, looking at the bird, asked the blind man, tell me, blind man, if you are so wise, why is there so much of jealousy and cunning in this world? And the blind man smiled and said, it's because there are people like you in this world who take what is not theirs. The hunter was shocked. How did he know? He walked in silence, and when he could bear it no longer, he gave the bird to the blind man and said, I'm sorry. and he continued to walk in silence. And he asked the blind man, "Tell me, blind man, how is it that there is so much of kindness and love in this world?" And the blind man smiled and said, "It's because there are people like you in this world who learn from their mistakes." And ever since that day, when the hunter and the blind man were in the village square, and if anyone asked the blind man how it was that he was so wise, the hunter would put his hand around his brother and say, "It's because he sees with his ears, but listens with his heart."